On August 21st, 2023, Mackenzie Shirilla was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison with a possibility of parole after 15 years. 15 years is not her release date. It is the first time she can stand before a parole board and ask to come home. If parole is really about remorse, insight, accountability, and rehabilitation, then the story being told around Mackenzie right now may matter more than most people realize. Hi, I'm Stina. Welcome back to my channel, or welcome if you're new here. I'm not a psychologist or mental health professional. My background is in communication, writing, research, and pattern-based analysis. On this channel, I look at true crime through framing, language, accountability, and the stories people tell around a case. And today I want to talk about the accountability vacuum around Mackenzie Shirilla. Not just what happened in that crash, but what happens when love, denial, protection, and blame start telling the story for someone. From the parents' public defense of Mackenzie to outside supporters who insist she is innocent, to the way Mackenzie herself talks about what happened. This case raises a bigger question. Can a protective narrative become so strong that it keeps someone from facing the truth they would eventually need to face if they ever hope to be free? To understand why this matters, we have to start with the sentence itself. Because parole eligibility does not mean Mackenzie automatically comes home after 15 years.
There's a very good likelihood, Mackenzie, that you will spend the rest of your life in prison. That won't be up to me. That will be up to the parole board, and that will be up to you to a great extent. I understand that the pain in this room wants me to impose the harshest sentence, but I don't believe that would be the appropriate sentence, because I do believe that Mackenzie will not be out in 15 years.
It means that this is the first time the question can even be asked. And everything between now and then becomes part of the answer. For anyone who is new to this case, here's a basic background. On July 31st, 2022, just before dawn, 17-year-old Mackenzie Shirilla was driving through Strongsville, Ohio. In the car with her were her boyfriend, Dominic Russo, and their friend, Davion Flanagan. The car reached nearly 100 miles per hour before crashing into a building. Dominic and Davion were killed. Mackenzie survived and was injured. According to prosecutor Tim Troop, Mackenzie was the only person in the car wearing a seatbelt. Troop also noted that Mackenzie had an airbag while the primary impact was on the passenger side of the car, which does make a big difference. So, in his view, the damage to the passenger side was so severe that airbags would have been almost useless for anyone sitting there. Now, those details do not prove intent by themselves, of course, but they do help explain why Mackenzie's survival became such a heavily discussed part of this case. And from the beginning, the question became whether this was a horrific accident or whether Mackenzie intentionally drove that car into the building. The case eventually went to a bench trial, meaning there was no jury. The judge heard the evidence, acted as the fact finder, found Mackenzie guilty, and sentenced her to life in prison with a possibility of parole after 15 years. Before we can talk about accountability after the crash, we have to look at the freedom Mackenzie appeared to have before it. Because one of the first patterns that stood out to me was the shift between adult freedom and childlike framing.
Even though she was 17, we felt she was mature enough to do that.
I love you.
That line stood out to me. Because before the crash, the framing was maturity. She was mature enough to live with her boyfriend. Mature enough to have that level of independence, of course. Mature enough to be trusted with adult-level freedom. And I want to be fair here. Parenting a teenager is complicated. I'm not pretending there is some easy instruction manual for where freedom should begin and end. But after the crash, and especially after the conviction, the language around Mackenzie often shifts. Suddenly, she is not framed by her family and other people as someone who had adult-level freedom and made adult-level choices. No, instead, she is framed as a teenager whose life was taken away. And before I play the next clip, I want you to listen carefully, because Mackenzie says something under her mother's voice that the transcript misses.
But I technically just am an adult, so it's just you
are.
can't. I don't feel like
Yeah.
it though. I feel like I'm just a kid still. I feel like I fit in better with the kids.
Well, that's because your life stopped when you were 17. You know, so
I
you
feel
got
like I'm just
you got a
immature
lot
as
of
fuck.
healing to do, Kenzie. You know, hell no, you are way mature.
I had to play it back several times before I heard it. And I'm glad I did, because to me, it sounds like Mackenzie may actually be trying to acknowledge some immaturity, which could be a small step toward accountability. Did you hear it? Mackenzie seems to say something like, I was immature, or I felt immature. And almost immediately, her mother rejects that. Totally. Hell no, she says. You're way mature. Honestly, the response comes so fast that it almost gave me whiplash. That moment really stuck with me, because the frame changes almost inside the same breath. And that is where the tension becomes hard to ignore for me. Is Mackenzie being framed as emotionally frozen at 17, still young, still wounded, still needing healing? Or is she way mature? Because those two frames do different things. The childlike frame creates sympathy. It softens the edges of responsibility. It makes her sound young, overwhelmed, and developmentally stuck. The mature frame, on the other hand, protects her identity. It says, no, she is not immature. She is not some reckless kid. She is better than that. But accountability requires a stable frame. You cannot use adult maturity to explain why someone had freedom before the crash, and then use childlike immaturity to soften the consequences after the crash.
Kids speak that.
Yeah, but she's a dumb 18-year-old that just turned 18.
Well,
and you guys are no. All the kids nowadays are dumb.
And this framing shows up again when her father describes her as a dumb kid. Again, I understand that from a parent's point of view. To a parent, your child is always your child, especially when something catastrophic happens. But this is the pattern. Before the crash, Mackenzie had adult freedom. After the crash, she is framed as a child. Before the crash, she was mature enough to make choices. After the crash, she was a dumb kid. And this is the pattern all the way through. And I don't think we can skip over that shift, because that shift can soften accountability. If someone is treated as old enough and mature enough to have the freedom, the relationship, the car, the substances, and the adult-level choices, then at some point, accountability has to be allowed into the room too. That same tension shows up in the text messages between Mackenzie and her father. Because in this case, the car was not just background. Long before the crash, the car was already part of a power struggle. In one exchange from May of 2022, Mackenzie texts her father about the car. She is angry that he ate fast food in it and left trash behind. She tells him not to do that, tells him he is done, and says she will hide the keys. Her father reminds her that he pays for the car. He tells her not to speak to him that way. He says he can drive it whenever he wants. But Mackenzie pushes back as if the car is hers to control. That stood out to me, because this is not really about fast food trash. It is about control, in my opinion. Who owns the car? Who pays for it? Who gets access to it? Who sets the rules? And when those rules are challenged, what actually happens? From what we can see in these messages, her father does state a boundary. He reminds her that he pays for the car. He tells her not to speak to him that way. And in another exchange, he even says that if she takes the car, he will call the police and report it stolen. So the boundary is being stated. But from the text messages we have, the threatened consequences appear to remain just that, threatened. They do not appear to be enforced. And that is the pattern I'm looking at here, boundaries without enforcement. If consequences are announced but never carried out, the lesson for Mackenzie may have been that accountability is negotiable. And again, this is not about blaming her father for the crash. It is about noticing the pattern. The boundary is stated. The consequence is threatened, but the behavior appears to continue without repercussions. That is very different from accountability. And after the crash, a similar pattern starts showing up in the language around Mackenzie. The focus keeps moving away from her choices and toward other explanations. The judge, the system, the road, the car, of course. The victims get pushed out of the center. One of the clearest examples of this imbalance shows up at sentencing. Two families had lost sons. Mackenzie's family was watching their daughter face a life sentence. So I want to be fair. There is no version of this moment where the emotions are simple. I understand why Mackenzie's mother would plead for mercy. I understand why she would focus on her daughter. But during her statement, the judge appears to notice the same thing that shows up in the jail calls. The focus keeps coming back to Mackenzie.
I'm hearing an awful lot about your daughter. I'm not hearing very much about the two dead people.
Dominic, okay?
That moment stood out to me because the judge redirects the focus in real time. She is essentially saying, I am hearing a lot about Mackenzie, but where are Dominic and Davion? And even after that redirect, the emotional center moves back to Mackenzie again. Her sentence, her future, her pain, her life. From a mother, I understand it. But from an accountability standpoint, that imbalance is hard to ignore. Dominic Russo and Davion Flanagan are not side characters in Mackenzie's tragedy. They are the two people who died. There is another sentencing moment that shows the same tension. Mackenzie's mother says her daughter would never murder the love of her life.
Because she would never, ever, ever murder the love of her life.
Emotionally, I understand why she says that. I do. But love is not proof that harm could not happen. Unfortunately, there are many cases where someone harms or even kills a person they claim to love. That is part of why crimes of passion exist as a concept. Love, attachment, jealousy, control, rage, panic, and desperation can all exist in the same relationship. And I'm not saying that to diagnose Mackenzie or pretend I know exactly what was in her mind. I'm saying she loved him does not answer the accountability question. It tells us what her family believes about her, but it does not erase the evidence the judge relied on. So the question becomes, is the family helping Mackenzie face what the court found she did? And that brings me to one of the most important phrases Mackenzie herself uses in the jail calls. Because the family does not only frame Mackenzie as someone who could never do this, Mackenzie also begins to frame herself as one of the victims of what happened. This next shift comes from Mackenzie herself. In one jail call, she says she hopes people will see this as an accident and that there is a third victim, her.
Okay.
I mean, I hope
There's no
the truth
sense in getting worked
prevails.
up.
If they see the truth, and they'll know that this was nothing but a car accident. They'll
Right.
just see that I there's a third victim and it's me, and I
Exactly.
lost.
The phrase carries a lot. Mackenzie knew Dominic. She knew Davion. She survived the crash that killed them. So, I am not dismissing the possibility that she feels real grief, fear, trauma, and loss. I'm not dismissing that at all. But calling herself the third victim changes the frame. Now, Dominic and Davion are not centered as the two people who died. They become part of what happened to Mackenzie, her loss, her pain, her future. And that is a very different story, because Dominic Russo and Davion Flanagan were not simply people Mackenzie lost. They were the two people killed in the crash. And later, the court found Mackenzie intentionally caused that crash. Both things can be true at the same time. Mackenzie can be grieving. She can be traumatized. She can be suffering. But none of that makes her the central victim of the story. That is the tension I hear in this call. But the calls also start circling around public image, how people see her, what they are saying, her Instagram, and the story forming outside the jail walls. And once image enters the conversation, the accountability vacuum gets even clearer. This next clip is not really about Instagram. It is where Mackenzie's attention goes while she is in jail, waiting for sentencing, with two people dead and her own future hanging in the balance.
And please don't forget to change my Instagram bio. Try to get into that one Instagram account and change my name to that
If
other.
they ain't hating,
You're doing something wrong.
you're doing something wrong. Okay. That, Kenzie, that may look bad right now. Okay? I'll put Free Kenzie on there, but that's going to look bad.
What stood out to me is how quickly the conversation turns toward public image. Her bio, the hashtags, supporters, critics, the story being built on the outside. That line from her mother is important. That may look bad right now, because that tells us they understand the optics. They know the public-facing story has consequences. And again, I am not expecting a young person in jail to process everything perfectly. I am not expecting polished remorse language in every phone call. But this is part of the larger pattern, in my opinion. The focus is not only on what happened, who died, or how Dominic and Davion's families are supposed to carry this. It is also on perception, how Mackenzie is being seen, how her social media reads, how supporters will interpret her, how the narrative is taking shape outside the jail walls. And that is where accountability and image management start to pull in opposite directions. Accountability says, let me face what happened. Image management says, let me control how this looks. And these calls, I hear those two impulses competing. And once you hear that, another pattern becomes easier to recognize. The consequences keep getting emotionally moved away from Mackenzie. Instead of the sentence being connected back to the crash, the deaths and the court's findings, the language starts to make it sound like something is being done to her. One line from her mother really captures that. This next line is small, but it says a lot, in my opinion. Mackenzie's mother is trying to prepare her for sentencing. And again, I understand that instinct. She is trying to comfort her daughter, help her survive whatever is coming. But listen to how the sentence is framed.
This is what I want you to focus on. even after she throws your life away on Monday.
That phrase stood out to me. The mother says, after she throws your life away. And I want to be precise here as well. This was a bench trial. The judge was not just sentencing Mackenzie after a jury verdict. The judge heard the evidence herself, acted as the fact finder, and found Mackenzie guilty. So yes, legally the judge made the decision. But that is not the same thing as saying she, the judge, threw Mackenzie's life away. The court did not create the crash. The court did not cause the deaths of Dominic Russo and Davion Flanagan. The sentence came after the evidence, the verdict, and the legal finding that Mackenzie intentionally caused the crash. That is why the wording is so revealing. In that phrase, the consequence gets emotionally relocated. Instead of being connected back to Mackenzie's choices, it becomes something being done to Mackenzie. And this is one of the main patterns I keep hearing. Responsibility does not stay in one place long enough to become accountability. The same thing happens when the conversation turns back to the crash itself. The field of possibility stays wide. Maybe it was confusion. Maybe it was the car. Maybe it was something nobody understands. Maybe it involved Dominic. Maybe Dominic did something. Somehow. But the one possibility the family narrative seems least able to hold is the one the court ultimately found. This next call is one of the clearest examples of the pattern I'm talking about. Mackenzie and her mother are discussing the moment of the crash, and the conversation starts moving toward alternate explanations.
I'm not going to say, but I have my thing. I think I know, I feel like I think I know what happened, but I don't know for sure. But it could be wrong.
A million things. A million things.
I feel like it was another incident of Dom doing what he used to do all the time in the car.
Right. That's what everybody kind of feels.
But I don't know if that's even true. Because why would he do that with Davion in the car?
Because he used to do stuff like that with other people in the car. Remember?
True. With Kendra in the car.
Yeah.
He was screaming at me because I dropped the blunt in the
right.
car. And he didn't want it to burn his car. But I was trying to get it.
Who was in the car?
And then he was speeding really fast trying to scare us.
Now, I want to be fair again. Families are allowed to ask questions, and they are allowed to wonder if something was missed. They are allowed to discuss appeals, evidence, and possibilities. That is not automatically denial. But what stood out to me is how wide the field of possibility becomes. As long as the possibility does not land on Mackenzie intentionally doing what the court found she did. That is the line. A million things. It could have been a million things. And yes, before a case is decided, people may wonder about a million things. Wasn't there confusion? Panic. Mechanical issues with the car. A medical issue. Did somebody do something like Dominic? But after the trial, after the evidence, and after the judge's finding, the family narrative still seems to leave room for almost every explanation except the one the court reached. It could have been a million things, except Mackenzie's intentional choice. That is a part I cannot skip over, because in this conversation, responsibility starts moving toward Dominic, one of the people who died in the crash. And that is delicate. Dominic is not here to answer that. He cannot clarify, defend himself, or respond to a new theory being built around him. So when any narrative shifts responsibility toward a deceased victim, we have to be careful. Again, that does not mean families cannot question evidence. But accountability has to be able to face the possibility that responsibility belongs where the court placed it. And so, in this case, that appears to be the one possibility the family cannot emotionally hold. Once that becomes the core frame, that Mackenzie is innocent, there is more to the story, and the court got it wrong, it does not stay private. It moves outward. It becomes the family's script. This next clip shows how the family framing starts moving beyond Mackenzie and her parents. It becomes something other family members may be expected to carry too. In this call, the conversation turns to Mackenzie's sister and what she should say if people at school bring up the case. Listen to the response they imagine for her.
That's what you just, you just gotta walk away.
No, Danny needs to defend herself and be like, bitch, my sister's innocent.
That's what she's gonna say.
And if she
yes, that's my sister. You know, she's innocent. There's more going on than you know.
I wouldn't even say that. I'd be like, bitch, my sister's innocent. Get the fuck out my face.
Right. Yeah, that's what she's gonna say.
What the sister is told to say really stood out to me because the innocence frame is no longer just Mackenzie's position. Now it is becoming the family response, the script that they give her. And again, I understand the protective instinct here. If a sibling or another family member is being confronted at school, of course the family wants her to have something to say. Of course they want to protect her from cruelty, gossip, and people reducing her to what her sister was convicted of. That part makes perfect sense. But notice what the script is not. It is not, this is painful, and we are still processing it. Nor is it, two families lost sons, and this is devastating for everyone. It is not even, I love my sister, but I do not want to discuss this case. The script is, my sister is innocent, and there is more going on than you know. That tells us something. The family narrative is not just staying inside private grief. It's being carried outward as a defense, a loyalty statement, a way to suggest the public does not know the real story. But where does the responsibility enter? That is a question I keep coming back to. And this is where I think the family system frame gets deeper. Because at first glance, it looks like the family is only protecting Mackenzie. But the more I listened, the more I wondered if they might also be protecting something else. Their belief that they knew who their daughter was. Their understanding of who they were as parents. Their need to believe warning signs were not really warning signs. And that brings me to one document that complicates the family's certainty around Mackenzie's state of mind. It is a CAD, call for service record. CAD usually stands for Computer Aided Dispatch. In plain English, it is the dispatch record connected to a police or emergency call. In this record, Mackenzie's father called because Mackenzie was reportedly threatening self-harm. I want to be very careful with this. The record does not prove what happened on July 31st. It does not prove that Mackenzie intended to harm herself that morning at all. And it does not prove what was in her mind when the crash occurred. But it does undercut the idea that self-harm concerns came out of nowhere. If a parent calls police because their child is reportedly threatening to end her life, then someone in that home perceived the situation as serious enough to involve emergency services. That is very different from saying there was never self-harm talk, never a warning sign, and no reason to consider that possibility in this crash. And if the messages with Dominic also indicate that Mackenzie had threatened self-harm more than once, then the CAD record becomes part of a larger pattern. Not proof of the crash, certainly, but evidence that self-harm language had already entered the relationship and the family system. That is why this document bothered me. It bothered me a lot, actually. Not because it answers everything, but because it cuts against the certainty of the family, of the parents. If there were prior self-harm threats serious enough for police involvement, and if Dominic had also experienced those threats in the relationship, then the family's public rejection of any self-harm possibility becomes harder to accept at face value for me, and probably for a lot of people. Again, I am not saying her parents are evil, and I am not saying they consciously ignored anything, but the family system question gets deeper here. So it occurred to me that maybe the family is not only protecting Mackenzie, maybe they are also protecting themselves from the possibility that there were signs, that something was missed, minimized, explained away because it was too painful to fully face. And I think that is human. By the way, this is not me accusing the family. When families lose someone through self-harm, guilt, shame, self-blame, and questions about missed warning signs are common themes. When a child or young adult starts threatening self-harm, acting violently, behaving recklessly, or showing signs of deep instability, parents often ask agonizing questions. Did I miss something? Did I let too much go? Did I mistake freedom for maturity? Did I set boundaries and then fail to enforce them? Those are painful questions to even imagine. So I understand why a family might cling to the simplest story. She was not trying to end her life. She was not trying to take Dominic and Davion with her. She was not dangerous. She would never do this. The system got it wrong. But if the record shows warning signs, denial does not make those warning signs disappear. It only keeps them outside the accountability story. So the deeper question becomes, are they protecting Mackenzie? Or are they protecting the version of themselves as parents who would have known, who would have seen it, who would have stopped it? Maybe both. And I say that with compassion, because that is an understandable thing to face. But if Mackenzie ever sits before a parole board, the protected family version of the story may not be enough. And in fact, it probably will not be enough, by far. A parole board is not going to be evaluating whether her parents can preserve the belief that this could never happen in their family. They're going to be looking for insight, risk awareness, accountability, the ability to say these were the warning signs, these were the choices, these were the patterns, and this is what I understand now. And if everyone around Mackenzie keeps protecting her from the hardest truths, they may also be protecting her from the very insight she would need to be able to come home. This is where the parole question becomes very real. Up to this point, we have been looking at the narrative around Mackenzie. How she is framed, how responsibility moves, how accountability gets softened, and how the story protects her from the full weight of what happened. It is also shaped by the record Mackenzie builds while she is incarcerated. And according to local reporting, Mackenzie Shirilla has had dozens of prison conduct reports since entering the Ohio Reformatory for Women.
The violations range from being out of place and disobeying orders to drug possession and video visitation rule violations. More severe violations also include sexual harassment and consensual sexual conduct or contact with another incarcerated person.
That is why I do not see the prison conduct issue as side drama. I'm not interested in turning every infraction into condemnation or gossip. That is not the point. One detail I think is worth noting is Mackenzie did not appear to rack up conduct violations immediately. For the first few months, according to reports, her prison record seemed relatively quiet. That suggests she was capable of adjusting, at least initially. But over time, the reports of the violations began to accumulate. And that is where the parole question becomes more complicated. When someone is serving 15 years to life, the record they build inside becomes part of the parole picture. Their adjustment, their conduct, their response to rules, correction, limits, and consequences. If the future question is release, then these reports are not separate from the accountability issue, and they become part of the evidence of change, or lack of it. And this is where the outside narrative becomes important. If Mackenzie keeps hearing that this was not really her fault, that the judge threw her life away, that the system got it wrong, that Dominic may have caused it, that she is the third victim, that people are just haters, then what happens when she faces rules and consequences inside the prison? Does she absorb them? Or does she experience them as one more unfair thing being done to her? That is not a diagnosis. It is a parole question. Because rehabilitation requires more than surviving time. It requires insight into why you were there, what led you there, and what has to change. So this is a pattern I keep seeing. I do not think this is a simple family bashing story. I think Mackenzie's family loves her. I do. They love her deeply. I think they are grieving, terrified, and trying to keep hope alive. And I do totally understand that. But love can still protect the wrong thing. And in this case, the thing being protected may be the version of Mackenzie where full accountability never has to enter the room. That is the accountability vacuum. The responsibility keeps moving to the judge, to the system, to the car, to public understanding. And eventually, even Mackenzie becomes framed as a victim of the story, while Dominic Russo and Davion Flanagan are two people who lost their lives. That may feel protective now, but parole is not built on protection. It is built on conduct, insight, remorse, rehabilitation, risk awareness, and meaningful responsibility. So, if Mackenzie ever sits before a parole board, the question will not be whether her family still believes she would never do this. The question will be whether Mackenzie has truly faced what the court found she did. And that is why I think this pattern could hurt her long term. Not because family support is wrong, but because support without accountability may protect Mackenzie from the very truth she would need to face if she ever hopes to come home. That is the tragedy inside the tragedy, for this family especially. So let me know what you noticed in these clips, because I'm curious whether this pattern stood out to you too. If this is your kind of analysis, you're in the right place.